Imagine this. It's the winter of 1287. You're a Polish villager, and the ground is frozen solid beneath your feet. Then the word comes, riders on the horizon, thousands of them, moving like a dark tide across the land, Mongol cavalry, the same warriors whose fathers had turned entire kingdoms to ash, the same empire that had made Europe tremble 4 decades earlier and come back for a second, helping barely 20 years after that. And now they're here again, under two commanders who are both powerful, both ruthless, and both absolutely certain that Poland is going to fall like it always does. But here's the thing, something is different this time. Something is different this time. Something that nobody, not the Mongol commanders, not the scouts, not the strategists back in the Golden Horde's capital, had fully accounted for. A secret weapon that had been quietly built, quietly expanded, and quietly perfected over 40 years of fear and hard lessons. And when the Golden Horde rode into Poland in the winter of 1287, they were about to walk straight into a trap they never saw coming. Welcome, back to From Start to Now. I'm going to take you through one of the most underrated military turnarounds in medieval European history. We're talking about the Third Mongol invasion of Poland, the one most people have never heard of, and the extraordinary reason why it failed so completely that the Mongols never seriously attempted to conquer Poland again. Stick with me, because this story has betrayal, brilliant engineering, desperate survival tactics, and one of the most satisfying military reversals you'll ever hear about. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why 1287 mattered so much, you have to understand what happened in 1241. That year is burned into the memory of Polish history, like a brand on skin. The Mongol general Batu Khan and his brilliant military mastermind Subutai sent a force northward into Poland, while the main Mongol army drove into Hungary. This wasn't a raid, this was a coordinated precision military operation designed to prevent any European power from sending reinforcements south. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, burning Krakow before most of the population even had time to run. They crushed a combined Polish and German force at the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, a battle where a Polish prince named Henry II, a man people called Henry the Pious, was killed, beheaded, and his head paraded on a spear round the walls of his own city. That's not metaphor. That actually happened. The death toll from the 1241 invasion was staggering. Entire regions were stripped of their populations. Towns that had been growing, trading, building gone. Archaeological evidence from this period shows mass graves, abandoned settlements, the sudden disappearance of communities that had existed for generations. The Mongols swept through like a fire through dry grass, and then, almost as suddenly as they had come, they left. Not because they were beaten, they left because Nogai Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died back in Mongolia, and Batu Khan needed to return to deal with the succession crisis. Poland had been spared further conquest by a death on the other side of the world, but the Poles knew, everyone knew, that the Mongols would be back, and they were right. In 1259, they came again. This second invasion is sometimes called the Second Mongol Invasion of Poland, and it was led by Barandai, a Mongol general who had a reputation for being particularly systematic in his approach to destruction. He had recently forced the Ruthenian princes, the rulers of what's roughly modern Ukraine, to submit completely to Mongol authority and even to tear down their own fortifications so they couldn't be used against him later. Then he turned his eyes westward into Poland. This time the invaders hit Sandomierz, Lublin, Krakow again, and pushed deep into Silesia. The pattern was devastatingly familiar. Cavalry charges, fire, terror, death, thousands more killed or enslaved. The Mongols demonstrated once again that they could reach into the heart of Poland whenever they wanted, and then they left again. Same pattern, same devastation, same traumatized survivors picking through the ruins. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because it's what happened between these invasions that explains everything about 1287. The Polish rulers, dukes, princes, bishops, Town councils, they sat with the wreckage of two catastrophic invasions, and they asked themselves a very serious question. What do we actually do? Because running clearly wasn't working. Fighting in open battle clearly wasn't working. The Mongols were faster, more disciplined, better coordinated, and they had tactics that European armies genuinely hadn't figured out how to counter: feigned retreats, encirclement maneuvers, coordinated multi-prong attacks. These were military techniques that had been refined across decades of conquest from China to the Caspian Sea. Meeting them in the field was almost suicidal. But the Polish observation, the crucial insight that started changing everything, was this: the Mongols were almost unstoppable in the open, but the Mongols had a weakness, a genuine, structural limitation in their military doctrine. They were not good at sieges, not good at taking fortified positions that were properly built, properly defended, and properly stocked with supplies. This wasn't a secret. Anyone who'd studied Mongol campaigns knew it. The Mongols had specialists, siege engineers, they'd picked up from conquered Chinese and Persian cities, and they could take fortifications eventually. But it cost them time, it cost them resources, and in a campaign that relied on speed and momentum, time was exactly what they couldn't afford to waste. So if you couldn't beat the Mongols in the open field, the answer was obvious, even if it was enormously expensive and painstaking to implement. You build everywhere, you build strong, you build high, and you make sure every person, every family, every village within range has somewhere to go when the riders come over the horizon. This is the beginning of what historians sometimes call the castle-building revolution in medieval Poland. And it is the secret weapon at the heart of our story today. After 1241, and even more urgently, after 1259, Polish rulers began a systematic program of fortification construction that transformed the landscape of southern Poland in particular. We're talking about a region called the Kraków-Częstochowa upland, a stretch of limestone highland that runs roughly northwest to southeast, characterized by rocky outcrops, hills, and natural defensive positions that are extraordinary. These weren't just gentle hills. These were dramatic rocky formations, isolated pinnacles of stone rising sharply from the surrounding land, the kind of terrain that military engineers dream about. Into this landscape, the Poles began building a chain of stone fortresses, not wooden palisades, those could be burned, not earthen mounds, those could be undermined. Stone, thick stone walls anchor to living rock, perched on the highest and most inaccessible points they could find. The idea was to create a network of strongholds that could function both as refuges for the civilian population and as military positions that would slow and frustrate any invading force. This chain of fortresses would eventually become known in Polish history as the Trail of the Eagle's Nests, and you can actually still hike that trail today and see the ruins of those medieval castles standing on their rocky heights, quiet testaments to the people who built them in desperate necessity. But it wasn't just about building castles. The entire defensive philosophy had to change, and here is where you really see the intelligence behind what the Poles were doing. They understood that a fortress only works if people actually get inside it when the enemy comes. So there was a whole system of communication developed: signal fires, messengers, early warning networks, so that when Mongol forces were spotted, word could spread quickly enough for people to move. Farmers would abandon their fields and drive their livestock toward the nearest fortified town or castle. Town dwellers would bring what supplies they could and get behind the walls. The idea was to deny the Mongols what they needed most: plunder, food, and the psychological victory of slaughter. Think about the discipline required to make that work. You're a farmer, and you've spent months planting and tending your crops. The warning comes. You have to walk away from everything: your house, your harvest, and trust that the walls will hold. That's an enormous act of faith, and it required rulers who'd actually convinced their people that the walls would hold and that there was a real plan in place. Now there's one more critical piece of this picture, and it involves a man named Leszek II, known to history as Leszek the Black, who was the Duke of Krakow and one of the key Polish rulers during this period. Leszek is a complicated figure. He had his share of political problems and was not universally beloved, but when it came to the defense of his territory, he understood the new strategic reality. The fortification program in his domains was pushed hard. The city of Krakow itself, already one of Poland's most important centers, was being strengthened. Krakow sat at the base of the Wall Hill, a rocky limestone prominence above the Vistula River, and the fortifications on that hill were among the most significant defensive investments in the entire region. And then, in late 1287, the Mongols came for the third time. The commanders of this invasion were two: Talabuga, who was the Khan of the Golden Horde, the successor state in what's now Russia and Ukraine, that had emerged from the Western Mongol conquests, and Nogai, a powerful and politically influential military commander who in some ways was even more formidable than Talabuga himself. The relationship between these two men was complicated, tense, and ultimately contributed to the failure of the campaign in ways we'll get to. But together they commanded an army that by medieval standards was massive and terrifying. Their plan was the same one that had worked so devastatingly in 1241 and 1259: ride fast, strike hard, overwhelm resistance before it can coalesce, gather plunder, demonstrate power. It was a template that had crushed kingdom after kingdom. There was no obvious reason it shouldn't work again. They crossed into Polish territory in the depths of winter, which was actually a Mongol strategic preference. Frozen rivers and frozen ground meant the cavalry could move freely across terrain that would have been boggy and difficult in warmer months. Polish defenders would be cold, miserable, and harder to mobilize, the winter also and that whatever crops had been grown were now in storage, concentrated, potentially plunderable. At least, that was the theory. But something happened that the Mongol commanders almost certainly hadn't anticipated at the scale they encountered it. When they swept into the regions they'd devastated so easily before, the population had vanished, not fled in panic, relocated deliberately. The early warning system had worked. People were behind walls, behind stone, on hilltops in fortified towns. The countryside was empty. The plunder the Mongol army needed to sustain itself on the march, the food, the supplies, the livestock, wasn't there. What they found instead was frozen, stripped countryside and fortresses that looked down at them from heights they couldn't easily assault. Now, this created a serious problem for the Mongol commanders. A medieval army on campaign needed to feed itself from the land it was moving through. You couldn't carry all the supplies a force that size needed for an extended campaign. The whole operational model depended on being able to gather resources as you went. But if the population had taken everything behind walls, you either had to besiege those walls, slow, expensive, potentially bloody, or you had to keep moving and hope to find supplies elsewhere. Neither option was good. The Mongols tried to take some fortified positions. The evidence from this period suggests they attempted to assault several Polish strongholds and were repulsed, or found the effort far too costly to continue. There's a particular account of events around Krakow that captures this moment beautifully. When the Mongol forces arrived outside the city, what they found was not the relatively open settlement they'd torched in 1241. The defenses were real, the walls were stone, and the garrison wasn't about to step outside and fight in the open. Duke Leszek, a decision that was politically controversial but militarily sensible, had left the city. Some say he fled, and his critics certainly used that framing. But he left behind a defended city with walls that the Mongols could not easily breach. The invaders circled, probed, looked for weaknesses. They couldn't find ones worth exploiting at acceptable cost. And meanwhile, their army was getting hungry, the winter was brutal, and the campaign was consuming resources without producing the return that would justify it. This pattern repeated itself across the theater of operations. Mongol forces would move through an area and find it stripped and defended. They could burn empty villages, and they did, but burning empty buildings doesn't feed your cavalry or produce the submission of a population that's watching you from behind stone walls. Some areas were devastated, and we shouldn't minimize that. People died, communities suffered. There was genuine destruction, but the critical difference from 1241 and 1259 was that this time the Mongols were not achieving the decisive, overwhelming victory that would translate into political submission and tribute. They were grinding themselves down against a landscape that had been deliberately prepared to deny them what they needed. And then there's the political dimension, which is where Talabuga and Nogai's complicated relationship starts to matter. These two commanders were not operating in a spirit of perfect cooperation. Nogai was arguably the more capable military mind, and he also had his own political agenda. He was not simply a loyal servant of the Khan. He was a power unto himself, with his own territory, his own following, and his own vision of where the Golden Horde's future lay. The strains between them affected decision-making during the campaign. There are accounts suggesting disagreements about strategy, about when to press on, about where to concentrate effort. This is almost always the case when a joint military command operates under political tension. The campaign suffers for it. There's also the broader question of what the Mongols were actually trying to achieve in 1287. The great age of Mongol expansion, the era of Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, when the empire was growing and conquest was the organizing principle of everything, that era was over. The Mongol world by the late 13th century was a collection of successor states that were increasingly fighting among themselves. The Golden Horde had its own internal politics, its own rivals, its own reasons for conducting campaigns that weren't purely about expansion for expansion's sake. Sometimes these campaigns were about demonstrating power, gathering tribute, reminding neighbors of your strength. If that's what Talabuga and Nogai were after in 1287, then the Polish resistance, the walls and the empty countryside, and the populations that simply refused to be caught and killed, had already delivered the campaign a decisive strategic defeat, even before the army turned around and went home. And that's what they did. They went home. The Mongol army withdrew from Poland in early 1288, having achieved far less than either the 1241 or 1259 campaigns. They had not subjugated Poland. They had not installed a tribute relationship or forced Polish rulers to submit. They had not even dealt the kind of devastating blow to the population and infrastructure that would have set Poland back by a generation. They had raided, they had burned some things, they had caused suffering, but they had failed at every strategic objective worth having. This was not how Mongol campaigns were supposed to end, and the significance of this failure was not lost on anyone at the time. For Poland, the 1287-1288 invasion, as understood as a vindication. The castle-building program worked, the defensive doctrine worked, the investment in stone over wood, in height over flatness, in preparation over reaction. It had paid off in a way that justified every copper coin and every hour of labor that had gone into it. Polish chroniclers noted with evident satisfaction that the great Mongol horde had come and gone without the victories it sought. For the Golden Horde, the lesson was subtler but just as significant. Poland was no longer the easy target it had once been. The cost-benefit calculation of invading had changed fundamentally. Yes, you could still raid. Yes, you could still cause damage. But a full-scale invasion aimed at conquest or sustained tribute extraction. The fortifications made that enormously expensive, potentially ruinously so given the Golden Horde's own internal challenges. After 1288, the Mongols never again launched a major invasion of Poland. The country was effectively removed from their calculus as a viable conquest target. Now I want to zoom out for a moment and put this in its broader context, because what happened in Poland between 1241 and 1288 is actually a fascinating example of military adaptation that has lessons which echo well beyond the medieval period. The core insight that you can't always beat a superior mobile force by meeting it in the field, but you can deny it the resources and targets it needs to sustain a campaign. is a principle that has been rediscovered and applied in conflicts across centuries. It's related to what military theorists later called the strategic defensive. The idea that sometimes the most powerful military move is to make yourself indigestible rather than trying to defeat the enemy in a direct confrontation you're likely to lose. Poland didn't suddenly develop cavalry that could match the Mongols horse for horse. They didn't. I find some tactical genius who could outmaneuver Mongol battlefield doctrine. What they did was change the terms of the contest entirely, transforming the landscape itself into their weapon. There's something deeply human about that, and something quietly heroic. The castle-building program wasn't glamorous. It didn't produce great battles with colorful banners and single combats that poets could write epics about. It produced stone walls and supply stockpiles and early warning fires, and generations of ordinary people learning to move quickly and trust the preparation of those who'd come before them. It was collective, patient, expensive, and it worked. I also want to say something about the people who never get mentioned in the history books. The craftsmen who quarried and shaped the stone, the laborers who hauled it up hillsides, the engineers who figured out where to put the walls for maximum defensive effect, the ordinary farmers and townsfolk who, when the signal fires lit up the night sky, dropped what they were doing and moved their families toward the nearest fortress with the discipline and the faith that the walls would hold. These people saved Poland in 1287, not a single famous general, not a decisive battle, not a brilliant tactical maneuver. Thousands of unnamed people making individually small but collectively enormous contributions to a defensive system that denied the greatest cavalry empire in human history the victory it came to take. The eagle's nests, those castles along the Krakow-Częstochowa upland, were largely ruined during the Swedish invasions of the 17th century, which is a whole other story. But the ruins are still there. If you ever find yourself in southern Poland, you can walk among them. You can stand on a rocky promontory and look out over the landscape and understand viscerally why those sites were chosen. The height, the visibility in every direction, the natural rock providing half the wall for free. You can feel the logic of the defensive system in your bones when you're standing in it, and maybe, if you let yourself really think about it, you can feel the ghost of what it meant. The cold winter of 1287, the distant sound of hoofbeats, the fires on the hillside warning that they're coming, and the walls, the patient, expensive, painstakingly built stone walls, ready to answer. The Golden Horde came back, one more time. In a sense, there were smaller Mongol raids into Polish territory in later decades, but the era of the Great Invasion, the kind of existential threat that had defined Polish political and military life for nearly half a century, was over. The secret weapon had done its job, not with a single dramatic moment, not with a hero charging from the gates to single combat, but with 40 years of collective preparation that made Poland too expensive to conquer. Here's what I want you to take away from this story beyond just the historical facts. As remarkable as those are, we tend to tell military history as stories of individual brilliance. The general who saw what others couldn't, the commander who made the right call at the right moment. And those stories are real, and they matter. But the story of Poland and the Mongols in 1287 is a reminder that sometimes the most decisive military achievement isn't a battle at all. It's the infrastructure built in peacetime. It's the preparation made when the enemy isn't at the gates, when the urgency isn't visible, and the cost of building is easy to question, and the political will to sustain a long-term investment is hard to maintain. The Polish rulers who pushed the fortification program in the decades after 1241 didn't know exactly when the Mongols would come back. They just knew they would, and they built anyway. That choice to invest in preparation rather than hope that the threat won't materialize is the real secret weapon of this story. And honestly, it's not a bad lesson for any era. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, this is exactly the kind of story I love bringing to this channel, the ones that don't get the spotlight they deserve, the ones where the real drama isn't on the battlefield, but in the decades of human effort that made the battlefield outcome possible. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who'd love these stories. And if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe and stick around because we've got a lot more where this came from. Leave a comment below and tell me, what other underrated military turnarounds do you want us to cover? I read every single one. See you in the next video.